Hello again. This is Jessie Czebotar, and this video is part of the series Unveiling the System. This is part 2 of Holy Doors and Power Seats. And in the first video, we go over what is this series about. This is about the Brotherhood system, which is a foreign government, and their sovereign military, which is a foreign military. And in this series, I cover, how do they work? How do they operate? And how can we know what they're doing, when we see things in the news? So we've been discussing in part 1, we went over the first 2 churches where the Vatican has announced that on December 24th, there will be holy doors opened. And they named 5 places where those holy doors are going to be opened. The first being the Basilica of St. Peter, the second being the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, the third being the Basilica of St. Mary Major, the fourth being the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, and the fifth being actually a prison, Rebibia. So we're going to look at their signs, their symbols, the things connected with that, and what that has to do with what we see happening now, what's transpiring. There's been a few major events leading up to this announcement. The first was that we saw the Pope meet in Poland with the head of the Orthodox Order of the Holy Ghost, which is Bartholomew. Then we also, from that, we saw the sovereign military gathering in the Warsaw, Poland area. And we talked about in the first one, as we looked at the Basilica of St. Peter and of St. John Lateran, that one of the big things in common with all of these basilicas is that they hold tombs of those that the system deems significant. You have the tomb of St. Peter, you've got papal tombs. So we're going to see that theme continue as we continue to look into the other 3 locations in this series. So let me go to a screen share, and we're going to start with the Basilica of St. Mary of Major. And again, I want to refer back as we're beginning to my site, kingdomlivingwithjessie.com. This is the series, The Unveiling of the System, and there's other videos already up in this series. If you want to take a look at those, they're packed with a lot of information. So as we get to the third basilica, we've looked at the Basilica of St. Peter. We've looked at, the St. John Lateran Basilica, and, we talked about how they have spiritual gates, how to tell if there's a spiritual gate. We also looked at that each of these buildings is considered a temple, meaning that there's going to be sacrifices offered there, and there's going to be temple prostitution. So let's continue on. We also talked about how there's a connection with eschatological things, end time things with these basilicas, and how that may play into some of the things that we're seeing in the news. So the next one is the Basilica of St. Mary of Rome. And, in this one, we see a little bit different structure, but somewhat similar to the other 2. We see here, we've got all those colonnades again. We've got the 2 colonnades with a flat header representing that there's gates there. We also see what looks like a triangular header and a dome there, telling us this also is a temple of Artemis. We also see very significant that around the facility, like right out, we see a straight line pole contract, or what could also be considered a Masonic easel. That is a specific Solomonic contract. We also see it here in the structure of the building itself, in this tall steeple tower, representing that base single line contract, which at the top, it represents a contract with Avedon. In the middle, it represents a contract with Ashtaroth, and at the bottom, it represents a contract with Leviathan. So that's important as we continue to look at these places to understand, that there's contracts there. And in fact, this pole sits in the middle of an area that's going to have a circle around it representing a fountain contract, but because they don't have the fountain water above ground, it's below ground, and that contract specifically is an additional contract for the waterways between Ashtaroth and Leviathan. And that contract even covers and includes the waterways to the womb as well as to the blood. And why is that significant? Well, that's significant because that goes back to the contracts with Jezebel on the land of Jezreel, which the Jezreel Valley, that valley breaks out into a larger valley that's known as Armageddon and deals with end time armies. So that's how some of that interconnects. Now, as we look inside the Basilica of St. Mary Major, we see very similar to the pieces that represent those single line contracts and the Kabbalah tree that we saw in several of the other basilicas. We see, like in the main structure of the sanctuary there, you've got all these colonnades, you've got a tomb area here, and then it goes up into where the place where the altar is. And we see that that altar sits underneath a canopy as well, which we talked about in the first video, that usually that means that that altar is connected to the high places and the low places. For sure, when you see a topper on it, it tells you that that basilica is connected to the high places of worship, which gets back into the worship of Baal and Ashtaroth. Then we see it break, behind this area. We see it break forth, where you've got some different symbols there, and you've got things that break forth into that line contract representing that tree of life, or the base Solomonic line contract. As we look closer at some of that, we talked about like the base contract, you usually will have something on the bottom representing a contract with Leviathan. Then you usually see a body here, and you see bodies there. You see the wings, the cherubim wings, and then the tops can look different. It represents the breaking forth into godhood, or the top of the tree, which in this one we see, what looks like the laurels on each side representing priestesses. We see a stained glass mirror with an image of a being on there representing the God man. And instead of just wings like the other ones, we actually have angels here. And we see the wings kind of in that going down position on top of the triangle, and all of that being significant in their mind, telling them, what's available in that place, and what's available to them as they engage in rituals and different types of sacrifices. So with this one, this is not going to be your main church for the sacrifices where things are happening during this season. Yet you still have seats here and altars that are going to play a part in different contracts that they're going to be making as the Jubilee occurs. Because in the Jubilee, some contracts are up, but they're going to renew some of those. And one of them in particular will share. But how does that play into their connection with Israel and end time events? So one of the main contracts that they hold is going to connect with these last three locations. This church is said to hold to hold different holy relics. One of those relics being the manger, like a piece of the manger wood that Jesus they claim, and you can see it here in this little, what they looks like a gold manger with a baby Jesus on top. They claim that they have a piece of the wood from his manger. And then we also know that there's tombs, believed the tombs of Saint Matthew as well as Jerome, and they also have the Marian icon and the tombs of 7 popes. So that's some of the things that, this place holds special. And then one more that's very important to kind of everything we see happening. And they have all this art that they display, but one of the things is connected to a Roman agricultural calendar. And within the system, they like to overlap calendars, especially about harvest time seasons. Those are overlapped with the different zodiacs as they divine and predict astrological signs and, what are the signs, what are the seasons, when is God going to be doing what, especially in regard to end time events. And they will fortune tell, what is happening and what season things are in. So that can be used for that. So we'll look at that in a minute here too. But first, as we look at this, we notice that on their floor, besides the first area we looked at, which you can kind of see here as well, you've got a spiritual gate up in that upper part of where that canopy is. And then you have another area here where, you've got the poles, the colonnades, and we see a flat header there. We see an altar here telling us that there's a gate here, and they've got the icon there, but it's literally like, here's a sun. They've got, a person there, like in that image of what they would consider their Kabbalah ladder, an ascension to godhood. That's where they've styled the icon. And that sits right in front of, you've got a seal here, and you've got a secondary seal right here that's very elaborate, telling certain things, giving access to certain things. So they've got everything kind of sealed right in this area for a second spiritual gate. As we look further, we see even in some of the areas, they have the tombs, and here's some different styles of what they've got. You can see some are more opened. You've got the 7 papal tombs there, and there's a massive underground catacomb that all those areas are around as well. We talked about how, the St. John the Lateran had a huge military barracks under there that's connected to the catacomb system. All of that, is desecrated ground because they've got the dead there. The second church that we're looking at here, and I think I'll have to look at the end. I think I've got the calendar at the end, but the second church that we're looking at for today, which I guess actually is the 4th out of this series. So you have the Basilica of St. Paul outside the wall. And you can see that here, the outside of the structure of the building again. And this one, we see it very significantly. You've got the colonnades, and you've got a very flat header. Then you have the triangular topper telling us that this is a temple and a place where there are gates. We see one of the gates inside here, which they do a lot of their artwork on the outside of the building in this place. And if you look at like the numbers of colonnades and stuff, even here, this is very similar to some of the other Jewish temples that you have connected to Turkey and other places in Jordan. And then you have some of the other temples that the system uses where, you get these long walkways on the sides, and they can use those as spiritual gates. This kind of gives you a good picture of those long walkways here, and this is reminiscent of some of the areas around Nimrod's Hill and stuff. you have some basilicas or churches that are connected to end time things that will have these long colonnaded walkways. And then you see they just have four palms in the middle with a statue. And all of that faces what they have as another, that header of the church right here entering in. So inside, this is that area we saw where you've got, reminiscent, you've got the canopied area. You can kind of see it here with the canopy and the four poles and the altar there, all resting inside that uh, Temple of Artemis gate area there. And we see, the floor work, that there's a lot of different seals on the floor, but the main, gate is actually, you've got several that are in the archways themselves, and they are distinct where you've got the separate poles and then the archways, and then, again, another archways there. So that's how they're signifying that gate and the threshold to that gate. And then within it, where this canopy sits, you have a whole nother gate access. And all of this is connected to different scriptural things they're going to say, but it connects also with, things that they say are going to happen in the last days. So these are some of the images of that Roman agricultural calendar that you see, and they've got, there's some different doorways or wall work. It looks like they've had an old doorway they've closed off there. And, so you see they've got a whole setup or archaeological area in the lower parts of that, and people can view that. But that's what part of the calendar you can see there. And then you also have we looked at that, that area where you walk in with the poles and then the canopies back here. We see on the top of the canopy, you've got the papal keys, Kabbalah keys, and you've got a pine cone up there. On the top of that, you've got seraphim all the way around. And that is particular, it goes to the order of seraphim, which I'll break down in another video. And then you've got maps and different things here that are significant to them, and tell a story about where certain things are in the area. So all of that's important for them. And I think the main thing, what I think all of this is leading to with the opening of their so-called holy doors is that they're engaging in opening doors for something to come through, and who knows at this point what it's going to be, but it's going to be connected to spirits. And I think that the last location, we asked, well, why did he choose the Rebivia prison? Well, this door that we see there at the Revivia prison is actually called a holy door. And it's also called the Bull of Indication, which, what is a bull? A bull is part of the papal documents, and it's a document that proclaims the Jubilee. So as they're preparing for the Jubilee, they're going to pull out this document, but it's interesting that they actually keep it, that contract for the Jubilee, and to have the Jubilee, on the sovereign lands. They keep that in this prison behind this bull door, which has the papal seal on it, which means that only the Pope can open the door. But where does this go back to? This is where it gets really interesting and ties back to the Basilica of St. Mary Major, is you have that whole concept of the sacred bull. And that goes back to Sumeria and the Sumerian worship of these spiritual deities. Particularly, it connects with Gilgamesh. And I'm saying that name slow on purpose, but Gilgamesh, was one of those that there's stories about in that time. about images that were created that were, these bodies of these bulls they had wings and, kind of had these weird faces that kind of sort of resembled humans with beards. And, they were known as guardian deities and were like human headed winged bulls. And they believed that these bulls were guardian deities and that there was a connection between those bulls and they would consider a genie or a protective genie spirit and Jupiter. So, if this holy door is getting opened, is it more than just a papal contract with the bull? Does it open up something more? um, Particularly in connection to Jupiter or the sacred bull, because the sacred bull also going back to that worship of in Sumeria with Gilgamesh, you get the worship of another bull deity or bull formed deity like Baal. You get Molech was considered a bull deity. You get, others that had that image of a bull like Marduk. So could it be, something in connection with their worship of one of the bull deities as well? And the return of sacrifices of the bull, especially in connection to Israel. I think that's where it leans most because, around this time period, we know that there are red heifers, and those red heifers have to be a certain age to be sacrificed. But once those are sacrificed and the ashes are used to consecrate the temple in Israel and the priests of Israel, could that then lead to the opening of further sacrifices again, including those of bulls and rams and others? So, what are these contracts all going to include, and what are we going to see coming forward? I think there's a high plausibility that we're going to see some stuff happen with Israel as well. Now, in conjunction with that, we know that the St. John Lantern Church is known for 5 main councils that it held. One of those councils being over the decision for a new leader over Israel. So there's been rumors of a resignation of Netanyahu. Could the part of this also be to establish a new headship in that presidential position over Israel? That's very possible too. So we'll see where this all goes. It's going to get interesting. We know that the order of the Holy Spirit, the order of the Holy Ghost, meaning both the Jesuit Catholic as well as the Orthodox Church, as well as the Sanhedrin of Israel, are part of what we're going to see happening over the things that we see happening in relation to all of these events that we're seeing. It's going to continue to interconnect and weave together. So I encourage you, keep your eyes on it. Again, I encourage you for more information on this or to see part 1, please go to my website, kingdomlivingwithjessie.com, and look for it in the Unveiling of the System series. Thank you again.